So welcome to this episode of the Culture Decoded podcast. Our guest today is Dan Strode, who doesn't like being called an expert, so I will call him a culture and innovation enthusiast who has a very interesting background that we'll drill down into, and currently spends his time both teaching, speaking, and consulting on the areas of innovation and culture. So Dan, welcome.
Thank you so much, Charlie, for having me.
The centerpiece of our conversation is your experiences at Santander, which as a global organization and one that has gone through several evolutions of its organizational culture, has a real story behind it. And the learnings from that I want to sort of drill into. But would you mind starting off just by talking a little bit about your background, how you came to focus on culture, and to set up the Santander story for us, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if it's fascinating or curious for people, but I started in consulting 15 years ago. And then I had the chance to move to Santander Bank. And if you lived in Milton Keynes like I did, you either worked for Network Rail or you worked for Santander, where the head office was. And I joined them as a project manager. So I was doing a lot of customer-facing changes for the bank, so implementing new IT systems, trying to improve processes. And I had the chance then to move into strategy and work for the CEO at the time, who was Anna Botin, who later became the chair of Santander Group.
She was the CEO for UK
She was CEO for the UK at that stage. And the bank was going through a lot of merger and acquisition activity, was repricing models, mortgages, promoting new products and services, a lot of change at the time. And from a strategy perspective, it was kind of quite simple to say, this is our vision, this is our strategy, this is what we want to do. And when we were thinking of merger and acquisition, it was using an Excel, coming up with a financial model and saying, this is the solution. What I found in practice was that the day after buying another bank, 50% of the leaders would leave, the ones that you had actually banked upon having in the organization, and 50% of the customers would leave as well, against the ones that you banked on having in your balance sheet. So it became quite apparent to me that actually the strategy was just half the problem or half of the challenge. And it became interesting to me, the people side of the business. So that I then had the chance to move to Santander Group, moving to Spain and spending 7 years there, 7 very happy years there, working and being the custodian of the Santander way, so the culture of the bank. And that was very interesting for me because we went through a massive change from being a male-dominated financial services industry, very Spanish at its core, into something much more diverse, innovative and digital by the end of my journey.
And
there.
international. And
international, yeah.
Gosh, there's so many threads in that, Dan. I'd like to come back to the M&A piece because it's an area that both fascinates me because it's so much intangible value and potential value in M&A lies in the cultural aspect, but it's often left out of the calculations and it's often what catches out the integration. I'd like to come back to that. But just anchor that story, if you don't mind, in dates, because there are, over the last 10, 15 years, there have been some very significant moments for banking and financially environmental moment. So when did that story start? So what years were you working in Milton Keynes and what years were you working in Madrid?
This was probably 2012 was the start of my journey with the bank. So coming out of the financial crisis, right. Seeing, Santander taking over Abbey National as it was at the time. I think that was post-financial crisis, yes. 2010, something like that.
Yeah.
And then seeing, the Spanish parent basically saying, UK, we're going to bet on you. We want you to become part of Santander. We want you to be a growth driver. And then figuring out very quickly that Abbey National was a mortgage bank and not much else. So it wasn't a typical retail operation for the group. It was a completely different type of business. So how did we evolve and take that into being a bigger retail player, which the UK now is, I think, the 4th biggest retail bank on the high street. So that was the first change. And then 2017 was the year I moved into Santander Group. And that was the start of a real global cultural transformation at that time. And one that lasted a long number of years and continues, of course, to this day.
Yes. And many people in the UK anyway will recognize the tagline "Simple Personal Fare," which came out during that period. Because that was both a marketing message, but also was a rallying call for the cultural transformation in the UK, let's get to that. So from a company perspective, going back to the 2017 period when you took over the global responsibility for culture and you went from the strategy role into culture, and that linkage is a point of interest as well. In the narrative and the heads of the organization, what was the problem to solve, or were there more questions than answers at that stage? So how were they thinking about culture, and what were they trying to solve, and how did that change over time?
Yeah, so I think if we look at a cultural map around the world, UK is probably one of the countries more advanced in thinking about work culture, workplace culture. And Anna moved to take up the role as group CEO when her father died, just in 2016. And as she moved to the group, she said, I want to replicate the great things that we've done in the UK across all of the countries. So let's do this global cultural transformation.
Using the blueprint of what she did
Using the blueprint of
London.
the UK, yeah. And the interesting thing was, the challenge that she was trying to solve through this transformation was to shake off legacy. To put it very simply, legacy in terms of technology, legacy in terms of mindset, legacy in terms of how we manage human capital and people and decisions that we make, and really trying to start afresh, start as a modern company, because the environment at that time was banks were under threat from the fintechs. Huge digitalization in the market, customer expectations were going through the roof, so they wanted personalization, which went back to the simple, personal and fair values.
Yes.
And banking also had a bad reputation, and Spanish banks in particular, but the Santander brand perhaps was way lower in terms of perception than it is today, because the terms and conditions on products ran to 25 pages. So you were not simple in the way you were doing things. So we had to change all of that and try to shake off years and years of legacy. And it was legacy that was rooted in tradition and history of the company, one way of doing things, a family business to a certain extent, with the Botin family being the rulers. So a lot had to change.
There's so many angles to that. You mentioned it was a predominantly male-dominated, Spanish, old-fashioned financial services or bank. Lots of different angles to that. Just paint the picture, though. What was or is the geographic spread of the business and the scale? Because it's what you're talking about is something which is really quite global.
Yeah.
So how big and what's
completely? So 230,000 employees in 32 different countries, but I would say 10 or 11 main geographies. So South America, you have countries like Brazil, Chile, Argentina, where you have a relevant presence. You have Mexico and then United States. And then in Europe, Spain, Portugal, UK as very big players there. And up until a few weeks ago, Poland as well, which was just divested from the group. But that's more or less the footprint, and then with very small presence in Asia.
Okay, but mostly your markets are places where you have scale.
Yeah, and scale has always been important to the group. So, Santander has been criticized in the stock market for being less than the sum of its parts. And the market is now believing actually the sum of its parts is really valuable, and the group is really valuable because we're rolling out this simple, personal and fair approach to having one mobile banking app for all the countries, one set of policies. So that one Santander message now is reaping the rewards. But 10 years ago, everybody was thinking this company is growing in a very strange way. It's trying to buy. But scale was important because we had to simplify everything, standardize everything in order to get the Santander way implemented.
That's very interesting, because that's slightly contrary to a corporate trend in the moment, where the sort of conglomerate premium has switched around over the last 10 years to being a conglomerate discount, right? Where many businesses are breaking themselves up and realizing that focus and specialization is the key. So that's an interesting contrary trend. Talk a little bit about, so that you paint a picture of a large multinational business, really at some scale. transforming itself from really, let's simplify, if you don't mind, the legacy thinking of being really quite old-fashioned, quite domestically orientated, quite sort of conservative, and a lot of businesses do talk about themselves either truly or metaphorically as a family, but that has bad downsides, that it can be political, can be based on personal affiliations. You often get a lack of real process and rigor, and much more about sort of it's the way we've always done things. So that's really quite a fundamental transformation. So bring the story to life a little bit. So go back to 2017. Were you the first to hold the role of global culture lead?
Yeah, I was the first.
Okay.
I came in working for a wonderful chief HR officer called Roberto, a wonderful professional. And he said, I remember meeting him in London, and he said, Dan, do you think that working in the president's office is, political and challenging? And I said, yes. And he said, well, you've seen nothing yet. Come to a global organization and a global role and try to influence. So you can imagine, I landed in Madrid 2017, not one word of Spanish. I found myself one of the few expats or few English people there, few foreigners there.
Yeah. Which is the case in point of the legacy culture.
Exactly that.
Yes.
People walking around in red ties.
Oh, nice.
The directors having their own private canteen with waiters who would serve you and take the lid off the food. Again, the directors having the car parking space closest to the elevator. And that was the first thing to change, right? So we closed the restaurants, we changed the parking, we made things meritocratic. If you wore a blue tie, you wouldn't be fired. And now you don't have to wear a tie at all.
I was going to say, there's the transition.
But it was a real culture shock as well to see that, especially coming from the UK, which, as I say, was a little bit more advanced than perhaps other countries.
And what was the early response? Because those first steps, particularly the symbolic things like parking spaces and restaurants, they tend to be the big high signal value, relatively modest in changes, but produces a really strong signal value. What was the early responses to what you were doing? And was it signaled adequately? Because sometimes the explanation of what you're doing is part of the trick.
Yeah, we were really lucky to have a leader that was sharing this message and saying, we are going to go on a cultural transformation to some extent, whether you like it or not. You have to be on board with this or you will not be here. So we had a large amount of rotation in the first year in the senior leadership, partly, because of legacy behavior and thinking, but also people not wanting to adapt or not being able to. So that was a natural evolution there. And then the signals that we sent were very much and very clear for that first year, 2-year period. This is our values. These are our values. These are our behaviors. This is the direction we want to go in and the reason why we're doing this journey. And I think if I sum up or I put into 3 phases the cultural transformation, I would say the first 2 years were communication efforts and just awareness and making people aware. The next 2 were changing and living the processes. So having all of your processes fully transformed. And then the latter 2 years were really living the culture and making tweaks and adjusting where needed. So it was shocking at the start. I think people felt it. I think people saw it. And also they started to change the corporate language from Spanish to English as well. So that was also a signal of we're now going to be one Santander. We're going to be a global organization. There's going to be power from the group, not the countries.
2 questions naturally come from that, Dan. I'm imagining quite a profound transformation. Did the messaging of your target culture, what you were aiming for, evolve over time? Or was it always clear, and was it about consistency of messaging and just allowing time and those 3 phases that you talked about sort of to take root?
Yeah, so quite a long story on this one, but I guess where we started was with 3 core questions. And I think this is why we were successful. We were successful because the culture wasn't invented by myself or anyone else. It was invented by the employees. So we asked them, what does it feel like now in Santander? And, we got some good things, we got some bad things. And then we asked them, what do you want it to feel like in the future? So that was something a little bit more visionary. Okay, if we want to be simple, personal and fair, if we want to be more digital, what would that really feel like? And then the third question we asked was, so how do we get there? And that translated into the behaviors that we implemented. So people were saying, we get there by being able to speak up. by being able to be open with one another, and they translated, as I say, to the behaviours. So that was the interesting first step.
Yes.
But then in latter years, we had to change the behaviours and adjust, because we found ourselves in a different position. And I think all companies should be looking through that lens of, yes, consistency is vital and necessary, because you don't want to confuse people, but things don't have to stay the same the whole way through.
And talk a little bit about how that evolved, because what changed to make it evolve, and how did it evolve? That's interesting.
So I think it was probably twofold. One was, after 5 years going through the cultural transformation journey, we saw that people were perhaps a little bit fatigued with the culture, continually talking about the same thing, having the same experiences. So we were thinking maybe we need to freshen this up. But we also saw that the underlying business was completely different. So we saw that we'd moved from a bricks and mortar retail bank into something that was now global and was more digital. So Santander actually has Open Bank, which is Europe's biggest digital bank by volume. It has Pago Next, which is the digital payments provider largest in the globe. So it digitalized a lot of its value.
Yes.
And the people could also perceive and tell us, actually, the old way of doing things, like focusing so much on risk, is not so applicable to the new model. Of course, a bank needs to focus on risk, but it might not be your number one daily alert that we need to be flagging to you. Maybe we can do it in a different way.
Yeah.
So that was the refresh process.
Okay, I had a second question, but I'm going to take that diversion. So what we see in a lot of the work we do with clients is not so much defining a destination and then assessing when you've reached that destination, but it's developing a cultural muscle in the organization. In other words, an awareness around culture being important and a constant focus for leadership, and an ability for leaders to essentially activate on an ongoing and a perpetual basis. That's important when it comes to a moment where your context changes, because as opposed to launching just another big transformation project, it becomes more of a muscle, and you're able to then to respond to the context change. Was that how it felt to you, in the fact that it wasn't so much a reset and a version 2? It was much more, okay, now we're managing culture in a much more deliberate and active way. We can steer and adapt based upon what the business needs. Is that how it felt?
Completely. So it was a tweak rather than a revolution, should I say? And I think people were not surprised that we came out with a new set of behaviours. It was quite a logical and a normal thing to be doing. And I think also if I look at something from the HR perspective, which was continuous learning and development, we used to do programs 10 years ago that were very hierarchical, very structured, very off-site driven, and so on and so forth. And we saw, actually, they're fine. You learn lots of new things, but actually learning in the flow of work, learning things in real time, having the opportunity to have new experiences is much more important for anyone to be successful now. So changing our approach to that is a good example of how did the culture change? How did you start to have more of a growth mindset? How did you have a more learning mindset than previously?
And more self-service, right?
And more self-service.
And so that leads nicely into an area I want to explore a little bit. And I imagine it changed over time, but how did the sort of ownership and center of gravity of the culture efforts of this transformation evolve over time? Was there an early stage where it really was centrally orchestrated, but then a deliberate movement outwards into local area manager roles? Was there, or was it always central, or was it always local? I'm interested as to how that changed.
This was probably a key learning for us. So it was centralized on day one, massively. This is global. This is a global communication from the president. And then what we realized very quickly was that's good, but people who work in the branches only really care and know about their regional manager. So it was actually the middle managers in the organization who needed to do the transformation, push this, and share the same messages.
But in a way that's right for their context.
Exactly that. Yeah. So I always think of it like the ice cream. 80% global, which is the ice cream itself and the cone, and then 20% local, which are the toppings that you put on top. So again, if you're in a branch, it's quite interesting that you get to speak to customers every day. Logical. It's quite interesting that you can do charity activations and things to help your local community. But if you're in the head office, you might be a little bit far away from that. So your context is slightly different. Mm-hmm. And if that's the case, how do you bridge the gap, or how do you localize for those contexts? So I think that was our key learning. Not everything has to be fully global. Not everything has to be completely common. But the underlying message, yes.
There's a feedback loop in that, isn't there? Because it sounds like the legacy Santander was centralized and hierarchical. So the natural first step, partly to create a unity of message and a clarity of purpose, was central. But inevitably, 230,000 people across 30-something geographies, it's difficult, if not impossible, today to try to control that centrally and unify it in a sort of centrally controlled way. So it sounds like there was a feedback loop there where actually, okay, the centralized approach ultimately, once you started to get momentum, sure, but ultimately learned from its own experiences and started to distribute responsibility much more.
Completely. And you notice things like, if speak up was one of our behaviours, speak up means completely different things in UK as it does to Spain, and definitely as it does to Brazil. Yeah. So when you know that, you need to adjust for the local context as well. And it doesn't mean that speak up's not important in any of those geographies. It just means you need to deliver and change things in a different or a unique style. So really knowing those distinctions was important for us.
That's a nice example. It's culturally sensitive. We get a lot of questions around, how does an organizational culture work in conjunction with national cultures? So global organizations often come up with this question as, okay, well, a decision-making mechanism looks different in Korea than it does in Spain, than it does in the UK, the US, Brazil, and the list goes on. Could talk a little bit about that, because you touched on it with that point around speaking up meaning different things. But what's the relationship then between a sort of unified set of company expectations around company behavior and leadership and local flavor? And is one primary, the other secondary? I'd be interested in what you discovered on that.
I think the key for me was, we are all living the values, simple, personal and fair. And we are all living the purpose of the bank, so to help people and businesses prosper. And that doesn't change wherever you are. Neither do the behaviors, but the interpretation may. Yeah. And the key for me was actually putting a lot of effort on diversity across the organization, so that everyone could work with everyone else. Mm-hmm. And that was the key for me, because we don't necessarily want to change the culture on a regional level or a country level, but we do want people to be mindful of it. So how do you interact with someone who's 2,000 miles away on the other side of the world? Mm-hmm. And how do you have great conversations and great business outcomes? Because as I was saying, we want to become a global organization. We want to have global solutions for the customers, things in common. So we had to work together. And I think that was one of the strengths. But in order to do that was learning how to work together. So really focusing on emotional intelligence or cultural intelligence in terms of diversity, and how to show empathy to someone, how to listen to another colleague, how to respectfully ask questions to learn more instead of passing judgments, and really getting under the skin there. So a lot of effort went into that.
That's really interesting. So what you're trying to create is a common mindset, ultimately, around curiosity, openness, empathy, questions, as opposed to my way is the right way.
Completely.
It's a plurality of thinking, right? Which actually what you're talking about, at least if I interpret it properly, is what the golden thread that ran through Santander globally then is a mindset, a sort of open, curious, empathetic mindset, which then actually applied locally in ways that were appropriate to that context. Is that
I would say so. And if I think about what we did with our leaders, so we would have, out of 230,000 people, we'd have 2,000 top leaders, and of those 200 most senior leaders. And what we'd do when we got the leadership teams together, globally and regionally, is we'd spend a lot of time saying, you are the role models of these behaviors. You have your local context, you have your local business, you have your ways of interacting with the clients. We don't want to infringe upon any of that, but we do want you to have this mindset. And part of the mindset is helping your colleagues, helping people in different countries, and so on and so forth.
We're one team. Right?
Yeah, one team,
yes.
One Santander, and that complete mindset there. So I completely agree with that.
And how did you track progress on this? Were there metrics behind it? What were the signals that told you were making progress or you weren't making progress in a particular area?
I think the good news is we learned that culture could be measured and should be measured. The reality was we did it in a very rudimentary way in the first few years. So we were trying to look at annual engagement surveys and metrics from there and try to extrapolate and say culture's doing great because people said we're simple. But then we realized actually we could survey the employees in a better way. We could use employee net promoter scores, but we should also couple that with all the other data that we have. So do we have behavioral references? Do we have people watching our meetings and seeing what behaviors are on display? Do we have other metrics like how are we doing against risk? How are we doing according to customer perception? How are we doing in terms of health and well-being? Are people using the services that we make available to them? So a ton of metrics and trying to cross-reference and verify and check against those. And it really became quite a complex woven tapestry by the end, but something that was working well. And I think the interesting thing was always when the board of directors had to look at the metrics and understand the culture. And when the company was brave enough to publish a report, which you can find online, about the culture of the bank and share some of those metrics publicly, that was another good proof point for us as well.
That's a lot of organizations are struggling with exactly that question, which is, firstly, how do we measure it? But also, we have quite a lot of data within the organization that we're not utilizing to inform us around how we're doing. And there's no sort of coherent. So you ran the sort of central culture office, did you? Were there other regional or country level culture offices, or was it sort of networked in? How did it work from a governance perspective?
So from a matrix perspective, I would say globally we were having X number of people working on these topics as center of excellences or functional responsibilities. So diversity, health and well-being, whatever that might be. And then locally in all of the countries having the same structure with a matrix reporting line. So reporting to their local HR officer, but also reporting to the group on progress. And typically it would be things like changing performance management. This was a big thing for us.
It would be.
We were the first bank in Europe to go 50% what you deliver and 50% how you deliver.
Probably the only one for
Probably
a while,
the only one
right?
for a while. Yeah. And I remember the European Central Bank looking at this model, understanding it with time and then praising it and saying, that's very helpful because it means you're not taking risks in a certain way, you're promoting the right behaviors. It was not an easy change to do because there was a lot of pushback from nearly everyone in the organization, countries thinking that they were losing power to tweak things commercially, and then individuals, particularly the managers, thinking they're going to be punished because of their behaviors as well, which obviously they were.
The game changes. And that's often where the rubber hits the road on these, is when you actually start re-engineering people's financial compensation, is where the portion of people who think that they can keep their head down and just let this initiative pass start to pay attention. So is that still in place? Is that
still in place, and now much stronger than ever before. So year one was a train wreck. People waking up with half the amount of bonus and then saying, I hate this, what's going on? Year two, a week before the evaluation, doing offsites in 5-star hotels and taking their team for pizza, as if that would help them. And then year 3 and 4 and 5 onwards, really living the behaviors because it was the right thing to do. And they fit in the organization in that.
And the managers who didn't see it as the right thing to do probably either didn't succeed or moved on.
Absolutely. So we did the performance management, but also 360 feedback aligned to the behaviors. And it becomes very apparent who wants to give this a go and who doesn't want to give this a go. And I'm always asked the question, how many people are you firing and moving on? But the reality is people self-select in a culture as well. They understand that there's many companies that they can work for.
Yep.
And the good thing for them in their career is to work for a company that fits them. So when it didn't fit them, they would leave.
That's so
and that was
grown up.
okay.
Yeah, it's a grown-up approach, isn't it? Which is, it's not, this is where we're going, and we'd love to have you if you are happy to adopt and adapt to where we're going. But if you're
Completely.
not, it's been great working with you, and we wish you all the best. All right, you've painted a picture of a multi-year process, one that evolved over time, but fundamentally just had rigor and resource behind it. And I think that's a template for lots of organizations, not just in banking, but I know of many large global, maybe family-owned businesses, which are struggling with very similar problem sets in different industries. Let's roll forward then. So since then, I'll get you to talk about since then what you're doing now. But I will say, just to intro this piece, is that you've written 2 books, and you've told me just a little bit earlier that a third one is coming in a few months' time. So The Innovator's Edge is the first book, The Culture Advantage the second, and in September from Web 1 to Web 3. So clearly this experience at Santander has been highly formative for you. So maybe you can talk a little bit about sort of that formative process and how that's then guided what you've done post that role in Santander, and how the threads of AI, technology, innovation, culture are sort of knitting together for you.
Yeah. Well, this will be a long answer, but I guess I enjoyed the cultural transformation so much in Santander.
Yes.
I came to the group with very humble ambitions, which was to improve the working life of one person. And I hope I improved the working life of more than one person. But if I did one, that's fine for me.
Yes.
But I really believed that if we could have happier workplaces and environments, we would have happier families and happier societies and a happier world. And, there's a lot going on nowadays in the world that's, causing challenges, but, work can be a center for many people. So that was my mission and purpose. When I left Santander, through my own choice, I said, I want to go and experience more things in the world. I want to see how other people are doing this. And I started doing that through teaching, through writing books and seeing what other companies were doing. And I realized this isn't about Santander and financial services. This is something that the whole world can take advantage of. And of course, 7 years ago, I'd had that hunch that culture was an important thing. I'd been able to see that link with strategy and culture.
You're amongst friends.
Yeah. And what I realize now is if AI in particular is democratizing knowledge, then the successful companies are not the ones that hoard knowledge and talent and skills. They'll be the ones that can differentiate themselves in a human way, in a way through their culture and their environment. And I think if we all have agents working for us and giving us lots of information and answers, it will be the people side that's the thing that we need to focus on. So I'm just enthusiastic about the world of work, how we go forwards, and what that means for culture. And I think it's a great spot to be in because people who know culture, breathe culture, care about people are going to be the ones valued moving forwards, I think.
You won't be surprised to hear, I both find that interesting and very consistent with, I think, the way I and the companies view the world. There's a challenge in that, though, I think, which is that you've described a long sweep of a growth in the importance and equity of the cultural aspect of organizations, and that is happening. But it's an output of multiple things. The individual elements that you talk about, and if I can separate what you've joined together artificially and talk about innovation, talk about AI, technology more broadly, but also leadership, those topics tend to get addressed in isolation. Organizations have to segment things in order to do them. Typically, large organizations have structures that actually encourage separation of these themes. And so what you've described as an integrated picture ultimately gets disintegrated in application. So what's your thinking on that? And I know that you're a keynote speaker, you teach, you also consult, and so you've got quite a view of this. How do you tackle that challenge of the fact that these topics are inherently integrated, or at least you've described them as integrated, but they're often applied in isolation.
I mean, I think the first thing to say is they shouldn't be applied in isolation. The great leaders that I see are the ones who are putting everything in a package, everything in the round. One conversation that I've had with a guy that you probably know, Gary Ridge, who was the CEO of WD-40 company.
Yes, he's quite a well-known speaker.
Very well-known person.
The Maniac Pledge, am I right in quoting that?
It could be, yes. Yeah, I think it is. It is. Well, he told me something really interesting, which was, my responsibility as a leader in the company is to facilitate the lives of everyone else so that they can do their best work. And it was interesting because the quote landed with me because he was looking at the company as a whole operating system, not just individual components. And in Santander, we faced exactly the same challenge. We set up an innovation group, and I think we went through 3 heads of innovation who failed one by one.
Because they looked at it in isolation.
Because they looked at it in isolation.
Exactly.
So I think you have to look at it as a whole, and you have to consider the company as a whole as well.
Now, which leads us to a second dilemma, which is that often the only person doing that is the CEO. You must have seen that in Santander, right? And some of the CEOs we speak with, their biggest challenge is, how do I distribute this concern for the whole, or the interest in the whole, to a broader group other than just me? Because me on my own, I'm squeezed between a board that has expectations, an organization that has expectations, and the only central point of integration of all these things is me. So was that part of the effort within Santander, is that actually, particularly at the senior team, but there's also an extended, that 200 people you talk about, is ultimately those people all seeing the whole? Is that part of it?
To have shared goals, shared responsibilities, cross-functional projects, those kind of things all help and contribute to people all pulling together to the greater good, the greater mission, in the case of Santander, the one Santander vision. But definitely it's difficult because everybody has become successful in their careers doing what they've done so far.
As specialists.
And they typically want to continue in that way. So you do have to persuade them and cajole them, whether that's through financial incentives, whether that's through the art of persuasion, whatever that might be. But setting that vision and saying these are the expectations is really, really key.
There's so many threads in this, and it could be rapidly expand, and this could be an episode of Acquired at 5 hours long. If we're not careful, we'll try and resist that. Just talk about AI for a moment, because you talk a lot about AI. I've seen some of your talks online. And you talk about how AI ultimately impacts the HR department, but it's broader than that, which is organizations. You've talked about it from the other side, which is as AI becomes more prevalent and more integrated, organizations that ultimately are more human and leverage culture are going to be the ones that really differentiate. But what about from the other end of that equation? In other words, the technology end. How do you see AI being used? That we're in a bit of a sort of a strange phase where there was explosive innovation, where the LLMs sort of hit the business world like a tidal wave between 6 and 18 months ago. But the speed of innovation has slightly plateaued on that, or rather the speed of disruption. But a big question that I see coming up all the time is, okay, well, the technology is amazing, but the applications for that technology are so far not hitting expectations, or we're not seeing the take-up of applications of that. So what do you see in terms of the take-up of AI, its usefulness, the actual application side of it? I'd be interested to know what you see across the board.
So I guess if I look from the human resources perspective, just to focus the conversation, but it applies to anyone or any part of the business, I look at AI through 5 Ps. So the first is process. So how can you improve a process? And, that might be automation, that might be, doing things in a faster way, and so on and so forth. And you can choose any process and go after that. And then LLM or another technology can help in that sense. The second P is personalization. So how do you really personalize an employee journey or a customer journey through the use of technology? And again, that can be a one-off thing, or you can do it for 10 different processes, whatever you consider. But the more difficult ones then come, which are the The third P is around data and predictive analytics. So how do you use all the data that you have as an organization with these new models in order to get great outcomes? The fourth is policy and procedures that you have. So are you using AI in an ethical way? Do you have a governance around it? Can you explain it? The most interesting one, and the one that I think people are failing with right now, is the fifth P, which is people and culture transformation. So as you say, 6 to 18 months ago, people have implemented AI and now they're not really getting the payback that they were promised. And I think that's because we didn't transform three things. We didn't transform the HR function, for example. So we didn't change the real way that we worked. We just added technology to our capability. The second is we didn't train our leaders and our leadership. So they don't have a cyborg kind of mindset. They don't want to partner with AI and see it as a co-creator or a collaborator or another resource. They see it perhaps as a threat. And the third is our people in general. We didn't give them a basic literacy understanding of AI. So they see AI as a threat and they don't really understand how to use it or why it's so important. And for me, it's that cultural piece, that people and culture transformation that we need to focus on now, because the technology, whether it's plateaued or not, the technology is there, it's wonderful. It's a question of how do we use it. So Are we putting the results of things to the hands of the managers? Are they empowered to do something with it? Do they want to do it? Are they being asked to focus on AI, or is it perhaps their third or fourth priority objective? And I think that's the key right now.
And that's the central thesis of your book you're releasing in September, is it?
Yeah, and in September, From Web 1 to Web 3 comes out, and we look at emerging technology, so blockchain as well, AI, but its underlying tone is, how are you using the technology? What do you expect from it? Are you partnering? Are you going in collaboration? Are you rethinking your way of working?
Yes.
And that's a trap people are falling into.
Yep.
They add a new process or they replicate an existing process and it doesn't work. So recruitment is a great example. You have a one-click to apply button on LinkedIn now. CVs are scanned by an AI. We're flooded with CVs. People are kicked out of the process because they don't have keywords in the CV. Imagine you're a chief HR officer and you haven't written the word payroll in your CV, obviously, but the AI is looking for the word payroll, so you're kicked out. It doesn't make sense. So we didn't change our way of recruitment. We just added technology and it's failing. And I think we need to be mindful of that.
So a subtext to your book is the cyborg mindset, is it? I like
Could
that.
Well be.
I like that expression, because a lot of people see it as a sort of substitute for thinking or a substitute for work, or something that's a threat to the common way of working. And in fact, what we find, and a lot of what you're talking about in the people and culture side, is really the central focus for Culture 15, is that it's actually an accelerant or an enabler to what you're doing. It requires thought and guidance. It's not the end in itself, but it can make you a lot more effective, have a lot more insight, or a lot more efficient in how you work. So the cyborg mindset, I really like that phrase, the cyborg mindset, which is to actually see how you use it as an add-on, an enhancer, as opposed to are we all going to be replaced with AI mindset, which I think if we're willing to admit it, everybody's a bit lazy to say we're all going to be replaced, right? Maybe Terminator films where they were too influential for us when we were young. Okay, Dan, that's really interesting. And again, a rabbit hole we could dive down and talk much more about. We like to play with a couple of questions with each of our guests, and one I'd like to take you back to your Santander time, because I think that's the way the question will be easiest to answer. But is there a metaphor in the natural world, a sort of collective noun that you would equate to the way Santander worked as a company? Is there an animal, collective noun for an animal? Ants,
because, I think as a group, we were quite strong. We were working in union with one another, and we were going in the same direction, but everyone had a role and responsibility, just like the colony has. So I think that's what I would choose.
Ants, that's a new one. Good. And the second question is the fun one, and we're still building the playlist, but if you think about your journey as leadership or your career path so far, or your views on leadership, is there a song that you can identify that encapsulates the essence of it all for you?
Yeah, for me, it's the soundtrack to The Sopranos final episode, "Don't Stop Believing" by Journey. And I've chosen that one quite deliberately, but I think we are now in a world which is rapidly changing. Things are ever evolving. Adaptability is the key trait to make people and companies successful right now. We have to change. We have to innovate, and you need belief to do that. You need to have a clear vision, a clear purpose, a clear direction of travel, and you need to keep trying. And I think no one has a magic wand in this world. We're all humans. We're all going in our own journeys, and we just need to keep pushing. So don't stop believing.
That's a great addition to the soundtrack. That's the start of the season 2 soundtrack. So that's a great way to start. That duality, though, if you don't mind me just picking up on it, the duality of long-term optimism but short-term adaptation, I think, is a very powerful metaphor. It shows us up in many ways, but the world is in need of optimism and belief. Organizations are in need of compelling visions and strategic narratives. But for them to work and for us to respond to a world that without doubt is trending towards disorder, we need a high degree of adaptability. Those two things are apparently in tension, but of course what you've described is if you can maintain those two mindsets simultaneously in your mind, you'll navigate your way through and you'll keep learning in the process. So super interesting. Dan, thanks so much. That's been a fascinating journey through your career, through the Santander story and through a broader canvas of AI, innovation, culture and everything. So thanks so much for all the insights.
Well, it's been a pleasure to reflect and look back with positive memories as well.
Great. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Charlie.